Our world has changed really in the last 5 to 10 years. It's evolving every day.
This is where we have to transition to, how do you make sense of this?
I think the most important thing that you can be doing now is becoming informed.
This is for everybody. It is a way to have balance in your life.
Really making sure we're helping the employers here.
You are not alone in this process.
I'll be going over kind of the what of the IRS ACA information reporting requirements. First, just to get started, a little bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, a little of the background. I'll explain the two separate types of reporting under the Affordable Care Act. Then, who must report. We'll also spend time discussing the forms themselves. We're talking about 4 forms here. I'll focus a little more on the C series because that's one that's going to apply to the majority of you here. Next, we'll talk about some methods and timings for reporting. So we'll cover how the forms must be filed or distributed and when those deadlines are. And then finally, I'm going to go over some action items. These are things that I'm sure many of you have already given some thought to already, but if not, they should be kind of the top of your list of things to do in the coming weeks and months. So first, a little background here. The requirements were established through the addition of 2 new provisions to the Internal Revenue Code. First, we have IRC Section 6055. This applies primarily to insurers and self-insured employers. And what it does is it requires annual reporting regarding all individuals who are receiving minimum essential coverage. Second, we have IRC Section 6056. This requires all applicable large employers. This is, again, anyone with 50 or more full-time or full-time equivalent employees, and this requires them to prepare annual reports regarding coverage offered to full-time employees. This applies to both self-insured and fully insured large employers, and it involves reporting to both the IRS and full-time employees on an annual basis. And this has 2 purposes. First, to aid the IRS in enforcing the employer mandate against all large employers, and second, to assist individuals in determining whether or not they qualify for a tax credit through the exchange. The burden is 100% on employers and carriers and self-insured employers to provide all the information the IRS needs to enforce both the individual mandate and the employer mandate. So who do these reporting responsibilities fall to under each statute? Under Section 6055, which again involves giving information on all individuals receiving minimum essential coverage, for employers with self-insured plans, regardless of your size, you're going to need to report under this provision. Employers with fully insured plans, you can rely on your insurance carrier to file this information for you. But as for Section 6056, all applicable large employers, so whether you're self-insured or fully insured, you must report on the coverage offered to full-time employees. Again, this only applies to large employers, which under the ACA, we're looking at those with 50 or more full-time equivalent employees. And this chart lays out kind of the basics regarding reporting requirements, and it's based on employer type. Just a few kind of key takeaways as you're looking at this. Again, for fully insured employers, you're only responsible for 6056 reporting, and this involves the C forms. For self-funded employers, you're responsible for both 6055 and 6056, but those who are large employers are permitted to do combined reporting with the C forms. And now I'm just going to briefly discuss the 1094B and 1095B forms. Again, they're generally only going to be relevant for insurers, for employers that are using fully insured coverage, or self-insured employers with fewer than 50 employees. First, you have Form 1094B, which is the Transmittal of Health Coverage Information Return. This is essentially the cover page. This is submitted to the IRS together with copies of all 1095B forms that are going to employees. This contains basic identifying information regarding the insurer or the self-insured employer who is actually submitting the form. Second, you have Form 1095B. This is the health coverage form. This must be provided to each responsible individual who received the minimum essential coverage. And the required information on this form includes kind of some of the following on the slide here, but identifying information about each policyholder, general information about the provider of the coverage. Then you also need identifying information regarding the coverage provided. So this will include names and social security numbers of all covered individuals, including dependents. And then you also need to provide information for each specific month, if any, where minimum essential coverage was offered. Switching to the 1094C and 1095C, which again, this is going to apply to the overwhelming majority of you in here. I think it's important to first discuss some of the information that you're going to need to gather to complete these forms. Most importantly, you need to identify all of your ACA employees for each calendar month. So this is going to require tracking and recording actual hours of service on a monthly basis. You'll also need to determine the total number of employees for each calendar month. You'll need your employee identification number, the social security number for all of your full-time employees, and then also you'll need to identify an individual to serve as a contact person in case the IRS needs to contact you for more information. I think you're going to want to make sure that you're picking someone who's knowledgeable not only with respect to your benefits and your payroll practices and policies, but also has a firm understanding of what you've been doing for ACA compliance. You also need information about the offers of coverage that have been made. Specifically for full-time employees, you need the months during the year where minimum essential coverage was offered, and then overall monthly enrollment information. And then you also need to know the amount each full-time employee pays for the lowest cost monthly premium for self-only coverage. And you need to know this for each calendar month. And then this last point is for self-insured employers. You also need enrollment data about each covered individual. So this is the name and social security number. You can use the date of birth if you don't have the social security number. And then also all months where these individuals were covered with minimum essential coverage. And as I mentioned earlier, determining an individual's full-time employee status is really of critical importance. So under the Act, a full-time employee is someone who's employed on average 30 hours of service per week in a given month. Alternatively, 130 hours of service in a month will be deemed the equivalent of this. And so determining which employees are full-time employees in a month really requires us to understand the concept of hours of service, which will include hours for which an employee is paid or entitled to payment for the performance of duties, or hours for which an employee is paid or entitled to payment for a period of time during which no duties are performed. This is essentially hours of paid leave. So you've got vacation, holiday, illness, things like that. Then as far as calculating hours of service, for our hourly employees, we're going to look at actual hours worked and hours for which payment is made or due. For our non-hourly employees, the law gives us a couple options. So we can again look at actual hours worked and hours for which payment is made or due, just like our hourly employees. Or we can use a daily equivalency, which is where we assign an 8 hours to each day an employee is entitled to pay. Also, we can use weekly equivalencies, where we assign 40 hours to each week an employee had at least 1 hour of service. And now getting into kind of the details of the forms themselves. So Form 1094C, this is basically the transmittal form or the cover sheet. And this is what all applicable large employers must complete. So whether you're self-insured or fully insured, if you have over 50 employees, you're going to be completing the 1094C. Part 1 of this form, it's fairly straightforward. It basically requires identifying information about the employer. So your address, your EIN, contact information. Part 2 requires a little more specific information. You need to provide the number of total Form 1095Cs that you're submitting. You need to designate whether the employer is part of a controlled group of related entities. This part also contains a section where a representative of the employer is going to need to attest under the penalty of perjury whether he or she has examined the transmittal form, and as well each of the 1095C forms that you're attaching with it, and they need to attest that they believe those contents to be true and correct. So this really reinforces the need to ensure that we have accurate information. This Part 2 also includes a section where employers can certify whether they are receiving or are eligible for any alternative simplified reporting or transition relief, and I'll talk about those in a little more detail later. And then Part 3, this focuses on monthly information regarding the employer and the coverage offered. This is essentially a 12-month grid that you're going to need to fill out. Column A is going to ask whether the employer has offered minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of its full-time employees and dependents in a year. So you'll mark yes or no for each month that you've done so. Column B calls for the number of full-time employees in each month. Column C, the total number of employees in each month. Column D asks whether the employer was part of a control group of entities in any month. And then column E is whether the employer was eligible for any transition relief under the employer mandate. And then Part 4 is only going to be applicable if you're a member of a control group of employers. And it'll ask you just to include information about the other employers in their EIN. And then we have the Form 1095C. This generally is referred to as the employee statement. And it must be completed again by all large employers, both self-insured and fully insured. It must be provided to each individual who is a full-time employee in any month during the year. And as I mentioned earlier, a copy of this is going to go to the IRS together with your transmittal form or the 1094-C. Part 1, this is going to be completed by both fully insured and self-insured employers. And this is, again, just basic identifying information on both the employee and the employer. And then Part 2, this section must be completed again by fully insured and self-insured employers. Line 14 here requires the employer to enter a code indicating the specific offer of coverage made to the employee in each month. Line 15, here's where the employer must provide information that specifies the amount of the employee's share of the low-cost monthly premium for self-only coverage that also satisfies minimum value. Then in line 16, this must only be completed if one of the safe harbor codes from the instructions is applicable in any month. And then Part 3, this is only necessary to be completed by self-insured large employers. And this calls for identifying information regarding any other covered individuals besides the employee. So the name and social security number, and you can give the date of birth if you don't know the social security number, and also requires an indication of which months the individuals received coverage. And then I'm only going to touch briefly on the alternative and simplified reporting methods. Boiled down, kind of describing them as simplified is awfully misleading. Even if you do qualify, they don't eliminate the need to complete the 1095-C for all of your full-time employees. And they don't alleviate any of the data gathering responsibilities that you have. And also the first two listed there won't apply if you're self-insured. So under the qualifying offer method, this is available if you make a qualifying offer to at least one full-time employee for all 12 months of the year. And a qualifying offer is an offer of minimum essential coverage where the employee contribution is less than 9.5% of the federal poverty line for single-only coverage, and it includes an offer of minimum essential coverage to dependents. So if you are able to qualify, which many are not for that, you'll enter an indicator code instead of the employee share of the low-cost single-only coverage, and you'll provide each employee who receives a qualifying offer with a separate document instead of a 1095-C. The 2015 qualifying offer method for transition relief, this is only for 2015, and it's very similar to the previous one, but requires an employer to certify that it's made a qualifying offer to 95% of its full-time employees. So even more unlikely that you'll qualify for this. And then the 98% affordable offer. Employees qualify if they offer affordable coverage, providing minimum value in each month to 98% of their full-time employees and dependents. And if you qualify for this, you get to omit the full-time employee count in Part 2 of Form 1094-C. So again, you're still completing the form. You get to omit a figure that you have to know anyway to comply with the A penalty and with the reporting requirements anyway. So again, they offer these three options. A lot of employers said, oh great, we can boil down this process. But when you kind of drill a little deeper, there's very little utility, if any, in using these. And then finally, what about how and when we need to report? So all reporting, again, is done on a calendar year basis, so you're reporting on 2015 information in the first quarter of 2016. For IRS reporting, all forms have to go to the IRS no later than February 28th or March 31st if you're filing electronically. The IRS would like all employers to file electronically, but only those who are filing more than 250 forms in a year must file electronically. It's optional for anyone else. And as for providing statements to employees, all statements must go out no later than January 31st. These can be sent to employees either through regular mail or email or posted on like an internal intranet site if you have one. But before doing so through electronic means, you need to give prior notice and the employee must consent to doing so. And finally, just some action items. I think the most important thing that you can be doing now is becoming informed. You need to understand these reporting requirements and your obligations that they're going to place on your specific organization. As far as specific actions that you should be taking, the most critical is to be identifying and gathering all of the information you need for 2015. I think the first step in this case for most employers, especially those that I've been working with, is getting an understanding of where your information is. It is very rare that all the information you need to comply with these requirements are neatly housed in one place. As I've already mentioned, it's essential that you identify all of your ACA full-time employees, and then going along with that, you want to review your timekeeping and record-keeping practices. You want to ensure that your hours of service are actually being tracked and recorded. And kind of finally, and this is something that I think should kind of be at the top of your to-do list, is determining whether you're going to work with a third-party vendor. At this time next year, you have already had to go through this process and submit your returns. So to the extent that you haven't decided how you're going to handle this, now is the time to do that. You want to make sure that if you're going to do them internally or you're going to use someone else, that decision has been made as soon as possible, so that if you are using a third-party vendor, you can kind of get the right person in place and kind of assimilate them into what you're doing to comply. You don't want to wait and try to be rushing at the end to get this done. So thank you.